Welkom terug by die GROOT Ontbyt. Vandag is Wêreld-vlugtelingedag en ons gesels vanmôre met die immigrasie-prokureur Craig Smith, spesifiek oor Suid-Afrika se immigrasieprobleem, ons wette wat ons toepas op hierdie stadium en hoe die hele land en die hele wêreld as sulks op hierdie stadium immigrasie en vlugtelinge benader. Goeiemôre Craig.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me.
Dis 'n plesier. Craig, as ons eers moet dink in 'n geheel aan die vlugtelingprobleem in die wêreld, dis nog sedert die begin van tye, refugees, die woord refugee verwys na refuse. Gewoonlik het mense gaan skuilings soek by 'n plek van heiligdom, 'n kerk of so. Dis van die begin van tye af is vlugtelinge al deel van die geskiedenis en as gevolg van baie faktore. In Suid-Afrika ook. Dis nie asof vlugtelinge in Suid-Afrika 'n nuwe ding is nie waar nie.
That is correct. I mean, you know, the whole refugee crisis has always been around and obviously came to the fore, especially after the Second World War, which was very much participated by so many countries. And in that particular war, obviously, especially in Europe, you had displacement of a number of people from various countries, and you have to, at the end of the day, people need to realize we live in comfort, but there are many people that are faced with the harrowing experience of war in their country or persecution in the country. And then following the Second World War, there was the first piece of law, international law on refugees, which was the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, which set out basically a treaty which the countries would participate in and become signatories to that particular piece of legislation, worldwide legislation. And South Africa, understand you almost have to look at it as a pre- and post-apartheid phase. South Africa, I believe in 1994, signed on to this particular convention, which meant and means that there are certain obligations on them.
Craig, can you just define a difference between an asylum seeker, a refugee, and an internally displaced person?
Okay, well, an asylum seeker, remember, if you arrive in South Africa, and that's another issue these days. How are you meant to arrive? Just want to say quickly, for example, in the UK, the whole debate is you have to arrive legally, otherwise you're already removed from the process. But an asylum seeker is someone who seeks refugee status. The person seeks asylum, but they haven't yet been interviewed and they haven't finally been adjudicated. A refugee, so in other words, they're in the process. A refugee is someone who has been determined to be a valid asylum seeker in accordance with the grounds under a Refugees Act in our case, or any other jurisdiction. And an internally displaced person is literally what you would see especially in war-torn countries, where you literally have no choice, but you obviously need to seek refuge based on circumstances where you're literally forced to leave and you become displaced from your country of origin.
You refer to an asylum seeker being someone who would ideally enter a country legally. In South Africa specifically, in our scenario, there's a lot of variations on the theme.
You know, at the end of the day, you've got to be sensitive to the plight that asylum seekers are confronted with. But it's also there's a delicate balance, and I know we're speaking about how do we get into South Africa and what the consequences are, but there's a very delicate balance between the government balancing sovereignty and how they protect sovereignty and its people, its citizenry in South Africa versus human rights. Now, when we signed up, we said we follow a human rights-based approach. And there would certainly, in the early 2000s, remember our Refugees Act is relatively new. It only came in 1998. And at that stage, it was relatively progressive. It would accept that you are experiencing very difficult circumstances, challenging circumstances, risk to life, and there wouldn't really be a quibble about legally how you would enter the country. But what we have seen, and all the various academics would now, having looked at the empirical evidence, you start and you do accounts of many of these on the ground of these asylum seekers. You will see that what our Home Affairs has done, and we've got to realize it's Home Affairs as the government, as the organ of state that regulates the position of refugees and immigrants in South Africa. But what you have seen is anything but, and we're on World Refugee Day, and the question is, do we have lots to celebrate, much to celebrate in terms of human rights, or are we tilting on sovereignty? And now we've seen a recent amendment into the Refugees Act that is the polar opposite of a rights-based approach, meaning pro-constitution.
When you have to think about the human aspect of this. Hierdie is tog mense wat op die einde geen ander keuse het as om vir hulle gesin en vir hulle eie oorlewing te vlug uit 'n baie desperate situasie uit. Ons dink selfs deesdae aan mense wat as gevolg van aardverwarming moet vlug want hulle kan net nie meer 'n lewe maak daar waar hulle is nie. Maar daar is nou in Suid-Afrikaanse wetgewing wat redelik nuut is, soos jy gesê het, ons het nie ons vlugtelingswetgewing is maar onlangs tot op hierdie vlak gebring. Daar is nou nuwe verstellings aan die wet, soos die amendments to the law.
Yes. What we have seen is, if you track the various pieces of refugees amendments, you will start to see that there's been a move, and whether this is knee-jerk, whether this is government policy, there's a lot of speculation. Remember, policy provisions start with the government, becomes a white paper, and the question is, there has been a move towards ousting the human-based rights approach, meaning the Refugees Act will give asylum seekers protection. It would be progressive. It would ensure that there's due process. It would ensure substantive and procedural justice. And those rights would be for all to observe, and there would be an obligation on Home Affairs to ensure that they're not overzealous. The new Refugees Act, there have been 3 amendments, and they all came into play in 2020, in the 1st of January. Now you suddenly see the Refugees Act becoming more draconian, becoming more of a negative-based document or piece of law that turns the tables on the asylum seekers and gives a lot of arguably too many rights to the authorities, to the government, to find ways in which you can exclude these asylum seekers from the system. For example, and the question is whether it's orchestrated or not by government. So not only can you have a harsh piece of legislation that starts moving the goalposts towards a stricter regime, which is more enforcement-based and less on social integration. And you could say, they're only, for example, the Cape Town Refugee Office has been closed for 12 years.
Sure.
Failing to observe court orders. Now, you can read in what you like from that, but that doesn't show when South Africa signs up to these various international treaties that they're doing much of a service to that. They're paying lip service to that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's a travesty. That's actually unacceptable. But you know what? There's very little oversight over the Department of Home Affairs, apart from the Home Affairs Portfolio Committee. And there's no civic body apart from NGOs constantly fighting the department, and that makes it very difficult to change the policy direction that Home Affairs is taking.
Yeah, Craig, it is something that we definitely have to talk again about again at a next time. Dit is ongelooflik om te dink daar's soveel Somaliërs in die land. Daar's soveel Malawiërs, daar's soveel Zimbabweërs, mense wat nie 'n ander heenkome het nie. Mense moet dit besef en is definitief besig om op hierdie stadium vir ons al amper 'n humanitêre probleem te raak, want hierdie mense het regte en hulle is tog mense wat net 'n beter lewe soek. Kyk, ons gaan verseker weer mee om te gesels. Ons tyd is nou heeltemal op, maar 'n interessante gesprek veral om net te besef dat nie regeringsorganisasies en burgerlike organisasies 'n verantwoordelikheid het om wette en die staat op hierdie stadium tot die reg te roep. Maar ja, baie dankie Craig. Ons praat later weer met jou. Dis dan Craig Smith, die immigrasie-prokureur wat 'n draai by ons kom maak het vanmôre. Ons kan lank hieroor praat. Nou ja, na die advertensiebreek, dan is dit tyd vir die nuus, tyd vir die finansiële aanwysers en die weer.